Hello everyone and welcome to Eastbourne Central U3A's first in a series of video talks. The talk is entitled Haemophilia, Rasputin, Faberge's eggs and the demise of the Romanov dynasty. And for convenience I've divided it into two parts so that you can view more or less 30 to 40 minutes, about 30 minutes to each part. Well, I don't know how many people could have predicted that a genetic disease like haemophilia would lead to so many issues for European royal families during the first half of the 20th century. Now, although certainly not confined to royalty, haemophilia has often been called the royal disease because it in a way started with Queen Victoria, who was a carrier of this particular genetic disorder. The mode of inheritance, in fact, is that it's carried through the female line and expressed almost exclusively in the male. In this pedigree diagram to the right here, we see Victoria with a dot in the middle, and the dots in the middle of the circles which denote females, and squares which denote males, so that would be Albert. And any black squares represent haemophiliacs. Well, Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and 2 of the daughters were known to be carriers, and one of the sons, number 8 on the diagram here, Frederick or Freddie, was a haemophiliac. The 2 royal families most affected were the Russian royal family, starting with Princess Alice, who, like her mother, was a carrier, so she inherited her mother's gene, and that eventually landed up in the Russian royal family, and Princess Beatrix, number 9, also a carrier, and her gene landed up in the Spanish royal family, which is another story. I'm going to focus on the Russian royal family. So this was Princess Alice, and she and her husband, she married into German royalty. They had 8 children, only 3 of them are shown here. The 2 daughter carriers and 1 haemophiliac. Well, the daughter Alexander, married the Tsar of Russia, and they had 4 daughters before they had their one and only son, Alexei, and he was a haemophiliac. So that was the first thing. Now, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, little was known about haemophilia, and there was no cure. And so poor old Alexei had to tolerate all the misfortunes of haemophilia. So let's go forward to today, because we have a much better understanding of the whole business of haemophilia. And I want to start with this picture, which is a human female karyotype. It means the total chromosome set. And humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or homologous chromosomes as they're called. And as you'll see, they're ranked here in terms of size, from largest to smallest, and also the constriction in the chromosome, which is called the centromere, which actually attaches it to a structure called the spindle in cell division. And we take these pictures in the light microscope at a magnification of about times 1500, and they are obviously visible, and the chromosomes are in their most compact state, which facilitates cell division more readily. So we stain this with a number of different stains. This one is a Giemsa stain, hence G bands. And you can see that homologs have similar G bands. So on that basis, the cytogeneticists have taken a chromosome squash and arranged the chromosomes as you see in the picture on the right. And right at the bottom, ringed in a red circle, are the two X chromosomes, which give rise to females. Now, not only is sex determined by these chromosomes, but they also carry many genes which have nothing to do with sex as such. And fortunately, if there are any mutations, then these mutations only usually appear on one of the X chromosomes, and there is a compensating gene on the other chromosome, which means that females are carriers of that gene, but as we shall see in a moment, the males are only have one X chromosome. It does raise the question, which I forgot to mention, of if we look at Queen Victoria's ancestry, we find no evidence of haemophilia previous to her. So how did the mutation arise? Well, as Emeritus Professor Steve Jones puts it in one of his books, the most likely explanation is that it was a mutation which took place within the august testicles of her father, Edward, Duke of Kent, who was a man in his late 50s when Victoria was conceived. So we've looked at the female karyotype. Let's have a look at the male karyotype for contrast. Much the same as before, except this time if we look at the ringed red circle, there are two chromosomes, but they certainly are not of the same size. The X chromosome is fine, but there's a tiny Y chromosome. The two pair together because they haven't got anything else to pair with. And this determines the male sex. And the genes on the Y chromosome really have no corresponding gene on the X chromosome. So if a male inherits, let's say, the haemophilia recessive gene, it will be expressed, and that individual will be a haemophiliac. So to summarize, haemophilia, which means blood-loving, is a recessive sex-linked or X-linked gene, and we know that there are many other genes that are sex-linked as well. Just to give you some idea of the size of these chromosomes and the size of a human cell, the smallest human cell is around about 5 to 6 meters in diameter. That would be a red blood cell. But typically a cell is about 20 micrometers, and a micrometer is a millionth of a meter. So across the cell, 20 micrometers. Within the cell, more or less at its center, you would find a nucleus, which would be about 6 micrometers in diameter. And within that, particularly when the chromosomes are compact, because they coil and supercoil to make them compact, the DNA and the proteins associated with it, they would be something like 1 to 2 micrometers in length. If we pull those coiled bits of the chromosome out, eventually we'd need, in order to see this, we'd need totally different technology, the electron microscope and probably some other technologies. We would actually start to see the double helical structure of DNA with its series of bases which confer the genetic messages. Well, what are the features and symptoms of haemophilia? Well, first of all, the blood fails to clot. Secondly, the patient is easily bruised. Thirdly, there are usually swellings at bruised joints and severe pain. And then, probably worst of all, is some of the internal hemorrhaging that occurs when the body is bruised. And this can sometimes, and usually was in the past, fatal. Well, there are two main forms of haemophilia. Haemophilia A, which accounts for about 80% of haemophiliacs. And that's caused by a deficiency in a protein called factor VIII. Haemophilia B accounts for about 20% of haemophiliacs, and that's due to a mutation in another protein called factor IX. Incidentally, it's called Christmas disease not because it was found on Christmas Day or has anything to do with the festive season. It came about because the first person to be diagnosed with this form of haemophilia in 1952 was a Stephen Christmas. Nowadays, doctors can give factor VIII or factor IX therapy intravenously, and as a result, haemophiliacs can expect a nearly normal life expectancy. In the past, this was not so. So, to recap, factors VIII and IX are proteins coded by genes within the DNA of the X chromosome. There actually is a very, very rare form of haemophilia called haemophilia C, which is not a sex-linked gene, but I'm not going into that now. Well, very unfortunately, poor old Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Romanov dynasty, was a haemophiliac. And there was no cure at that stage. We move on then to look at the involvement of this man, Grigory Rasputin, the man with the mesmeric eyes. Well, Rasputin came from very poor Siberian stock. He was born on the 21st of January 1869, and his youth was somewhat misspent. There was much petty thieving. To rectify this, he was sent to a monastery in the Ural Mountains. I should think it was pretty Spartan. But there he met and was influenced by a holy man called Macquarie, who encouraged him to lead a life of austerity. And whilst he did adopt many of the monastic ways and became a cleric in one sense, he desperately wanted to travel. And that was the overriding thing. So he left this particular monastery and started on his many travels, which he did throughout his life, probably covered thousands of miles and visited a number of different countries. Well, he didn't get so far in his first series of travels because when he was in Abalak in Siberia, he met and married this lady, Praskovaya Dubrovina. My Russian is terrible. They apparently had 7 children, so he was around a bit, but only 3 of them survived. As you can see from this rather hazy picture, but there are not too many of these around. Well, Rasputin was a very controversial figure. He certainly had a great following. He clearly was a mesmeric, very influential man, and he particularly collected around him quite large congregations, most of whom were young women. There were a few young men. And some of these young women were destined to bathe him and dress him before he gave services or oratories. And one of Rasputin's mottos was that we have salvation through sin. So yes, he wandered over several countries and eventually established himself as a spiritual leader. And as we can see from this picture, most of his followers were young women. There was a certain amount of jealousy amongst, I think, other monks, because their congregations declined, whereas Rasputin's enlarged. And one of his great sayings, translated obviously from the Russian, "When I go to confession, I don't offer God small sins, I offer him sins worth forgiving." I like that. Well, from there, he went for a short while to this monastery in Kazan, which is still towards eastern Russia. It's called the Seven Lakes Monastery. And having built up a reputation as a holy wanderer who could predict the future, as we shall see in a minute, and also a faith healer, he could apparently heal the sick. Whether his mesmeric eyes or hypnotic eyes had anything to do with this is debatable. So despite these rumours of sexual orgies, and I think a lot of it was perhaps jealousy, he impressed this man, Bishop Sergei of the monastery in Kazan, to attend the big seminary in St. Petersburg. Rasputin particularly wanted to go to St. Petersburg, and the place there was the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. And here he met and impressed a man called Archimandrite Theophanes. Archimandrite was roughly equivalent to what we would call an archbishop. And here we see a picture of Archimandrite Theophanes in the middle on the left-hand side, with Rasputin on his right-hand side, and another young priest called Iliador on his left. At the time this photograph was taken, the two young priests were friends, but as time went by, they became arch enemies. They had different followers, and it's even muted that Iliador was responsible for one of the many assassination attempts on Rasputin's life. And here on the right is the very splendid Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg, or just outside it actually. So how did a poor Siberian monk become the confidant of the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia? Well, because of his connections with the Archimandrite, Rasputin became a bit of what we would call today a celebrity figure, and moved therefore in elite social circles. And in doing so, he met these two princesses, referred to as the Dark Princesses, Melissa and Anastasia, because they were into the occult, seances, spiritualism, which was very popular at this time in many European countries. Conan Doyle, Alfred Russel Wallace in this country were also very much into spiritualism. The significance of the two sisters, or the two princesses, was that they were married to Grand Dukes, Grand Duke Peter and Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich. And these two gentlemen were cousins of the Tsar. So the Tsar and the Tsarina were eventually first introduced to Rasputin on the 1st of November 1905. The Tsar himself had come into power somewhat quickly in 1894 because his father, who was a very powerful Tsar, died suddenly of kidney failure or nephritis. Just as a digression, because we're talking about Eastbourne, Alexandra was one of Queen Victoria's favourite granddaughters. And as a result, she was invited to this country on a number of occasions. And on one occasion, she stopped at this place, Compton Place, Eastbourne. And presumably she was about 18 years old at this time. Presumably she was a little bit bored on one day and etched her name and the date on which she did it on one of the windows, which is still there. As I say, she was a very beautiful young lady, and Queen Victoria tried to match her with one of her sons, George V, or eventually became George V. However, she was more enamoured with the young Tsarevich of Russia, and he with her. And eventually, of course, she married him, and King George V, who looked remarkably like his cousin, the Tsar, married Mary of Hesse. So, shortly after the death of his father, the marriage was actually postponed for a little while until Alexander III, the previous Tsar, his funeral had been over and there had been a little bit of court mourning. And Nicholas and Alexander were very suited. They were a loving couple. He was a good husband and a very good father as well. They had 4 daughters: Olga, Titania, Maria, and who's the other one? I can't remember at the moment. I shall remember in a minute. And a son, the only son, Alexei. Everything went reasonably well for the Tsar when he took over, and he didn't want to be Tsar. He didn't relish the idea at all. He wasn't really cut out for it. Because you have to remember that the Tsarist regime was a total autocracy. The Tsar almost was regarded as a godlike figure. But then there was a disagreement between Russia and Japan over land rights, particularly in what is now Manchuria and Korea, and they went to war. And although the Russians had certainly far more numbers than the Japanese, they were poorly trained and poorly equipped. And so the Japanese killed many Russians. About 100,000 Russians were either killed, wounded, or imprisoned. There was almost a complete decimation of the Russian navy, and so the Tsar was forced to concede land and capitulate to the Japanese. For some slight relief, fortunately, because they desperately wanted a male heir to the Romanov dynasty, and fortunately Alexei was born on the 12th of August in 1904. But the good times, and of course the royal couple were absolutely jubilant, as indeed were most of the Russian people. But unfortunately there was a lot of unrest in the background, mainly because there was intense poverty. Many people were out of work and certainly therefore couldn't get food. So there was a massive workers' demonstration outside. It walked to and went to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It was quite peaceful, and it was demanding higher wages and better housing. And this took place on Sunday, the 22nd of January, 1905. It became known as Bloody Sunday. And the consensus of opinion was that the Tsar and Tsarina, the family, were not in the Winter Palace, even though the mob, the so-called demonstration, thought they were. And the military guard who were guarding the palace, as the mob grew closer, they, I think, panicked and opened fire, which led to one of the worst massacres in Russian history at that time. So that was not good. Well, let's come back to why Rasputin was such an influence over the Tsar and Tsarina. He appeared to be a health healer who could perform miracles, actually not just on the young Alexei, but also other members of the royal court. But Alexei was the important one. And as I say, he was first introduced to Alexei in October 1906. And that was because he had one of his first major haemophilic episodes on the 12th of October in that year. Rasputin's prayers appeared to cure him the next day, quite extraordinary. Then in June 1907, he had a particularly bad fall which caused serious internal bleeding and excruciating pain. The young boy was not expected to live. But Rasputin came along, laid a hand on his leg and prayed for some hours. And the next morning, miraculously, the young man was up and about as if nothing had happened the previous day. And then on October the 2nd in 1912, a very rough carriage ride caused Alexei internal bleeding. Rasputin wasn't immediately on hand, but he was contacted, and long-distance prayers once again brought recovery, and he said the little one will not die. As I say, there were other instances of his healing powers with other members of the royal household. He could also predict events of the future. And one of the most famous of these, translated of course into English, came to the Tsar in 1915. If I am killed by common men, you and your children will rule Russia for centuries to come. If I'm killed by one of your stock, you and your family will be killed by the Russian people. Pray, Tsar of Russia, pray. And that was a very interesting prediction. But his hold over the Tsar, and particularly the Tsarina, the royal family called him their friend. And despite his misdemeanors, they always came back to him. To punish him for one of his misdemeanors, he was sent to the Holy Land for 6 months, which he wanted to do anyway, all expenses paid. So it was hardly a very severe punishment. And eventually people started to talk about Rasputin's reign, and this is a wonderful cartoon from that time. Well, what were the things that eventually led to Rasputin's death? Well, once again, he predicted that Russia would not win against the Germans at the Russian-German front if they went to World War I, and strongly discouraged the Tsar from doing so. Possibly he might lose his job as well, but nevertheless, he was strongly against it. But once war was started in 1914, Rasputin started to give political advice and advice on military tactics, which certainly weren't appreciated by the Russian Duma, which was started in 1905, 1906, as a means of trying to install civil liberties with the population. It was conceded as a result of that workers' massacre. And of course the generals weren't terribly impressed either. And to make matters worse, the Tsar himself went to the front to take over the army, but he was really not that well equipped as a general. Yes, so I've already said the Russian Duma, or the parliament, started I think in 1906, was rendered ineffective. Rasputin particularly was influential with the Tsarina. There were even rumours of a sort of romantic liaison, but I think those were not true. And so the Tsar very much listened to his wife, who had quite strong views. And one historian wrote, the throne was surrounded by scoundrels, non-entities and idiots. And this gradually left to a loss of respect and loyalty for the royal family from all classes of society. As I say, Nicholas was a good husband and father, but he was not a good leader. He was hesitant, non-committal, even obstinate at times. He might have possibly made a good constitutional monarch, as we have in the United Kingdom, where decisions are made by Parliament. But he was not good as the all-powerful Tsar. He was very much indecisive. And so there were several attempts to assassinate him. One of the first major attempts was by this woman. I don't think she was involved in any particular plot. She was probably somewhat insane. But Rasputin had gone back to his village for a short while, and outside his house, this lady, Gionia Guseva, stabbed Rasputin in the stomach. Gory reports say that his intestines were hanging out. We cannot verify that. But what Rasputin did, because they had to call a doctor, they arrested this woman, called a doctor, but it took 8 hours for the doctor to come to his rescue. And during that period of time, Rasputin put his hand and pressure on the wound to stop it from bleeding excessively. Eventually the doctor came and did surgery almost on the spot without any anaesthetic. And eventually, of course, Rasputin passed out. His natural anaesthetics kicked in. He was taken to hospital, and it took 46 days for him to recover from this particular stabbing. There were other assassination attempts. There was one where he was nearly run over by a coach and horses, and this was mooted to be influenced by Iliador. So Rasputin, although having many friends, especially amongst the royal family, also had many enemies. And a conspiracy assassination was put together by this man, who was the main person, and this was Prince Felix Yusupov. Next to the Tsar, he was the second richest man in Russia, and of course he was also related to the Tsar. And also the Grand Duke Pavlovich and one or two other people in the assassination plot. And what they did was to invite Rasputin to meet some of the elite of society in Yusupov's house. And so when he came, they took him down to the basement room here and fed him on cakes and wine, all of which were laced with cyanide. So they expected him to die fairly quickly. Rasputin took up the invitation, particularly because there were some really quite influential people who were coming, apparently. They didn't come, of course. And on the promise that Irina, Yusupov's wife, a very beautiful woman who Rasputin lusted after, would also be there. So when Yusupov went down after a while to see how Rasputin was doing, he was very much alive and said he'd like some more cakes and some wine whilst he was waiting. And given that Prince Yusupov was an accomplished musician, perhaps he could play a tune on his guitar for him while he did so. And so he tucked into this second lot of cyanide-poisoned cakes and wine. Well, this freaked Yusupov out. And we have this information mainly from Yusupov's diary, because he kept pretty extensive information in his diary. So you're getting really Yusupov's account. He, after he played a tune, went upstairs to his fellow conspirators, grabbed a gun, went down to the basement again, and shot Rasputin in the back. The other conspirators came down to see whether Rasputin was dead, having looked at him and sort of felt his pulse, not terribly well I would imagine, they declared that he was dead. So they went upstairs. Yusupov, exhausted, sat down in the chair near to the body of Rasputin. After a while, to his amazement, Rasputin opened his eyes and got up and lunged towards him, whereupon Yusupov fled back to the conspirators, and then of course they all picked up guns, because at this stage they saw Rasputin in the courtyard of the house running away, or certainly moving away, and started to fire rather randomly. Eventually, one of the shots hit Rasputin in the head. Surely he was dead now. However, when they came to him, he was still breathing. He was a hard man to kill. So Yusupov got a club and battered him to death, and to ensure that he really was going to die, the conspirators wrapped him in a blue rug and tied it together, and then went to this wooden bridge, the Bolshoi-Petrovsky Bridge in St. Petersburg, and threw his body in the Nevka River. Now this happened on the night of the 29th of December and into the 30th of December, so the water was icy cold. His body was eventually discovered on the 30th, and instead of the conspirators being tried for murder, they were greeted as heroes, and virtually all the Russian people thought they'd done a wonderful thing. The only people who didn't think he'd done a wonderful thing were the Tsar and Tsarina. So I think we'll stop it there and come back for the second half later.